My name is Jules Pretty. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor and also a member of the Burrows Committee that has chosen tonight's lecture from Richard Mabey. This is the 42nd Burrows Lecture. They began in 1966 with an endowment from Major J.H. Burrows, who was the proprietor of the Southend Standard group of newspapers, and he wanted an annual lecture that would be reflective of Essex as well as kind of having a link to the University of Essex as well. The last few years, the event has been linked closely to the Essex Book Festival and has formed part of the celebrations with the Book Festival. So it's a great pleasure to welcome friend and colleague Richard Mabey, one of Britain's best nature writers, I think it's fair to say, and broadcasters. Best-selling, best-loved as well. Also an honorary doctor of the University of Essex, which we're delighted to have conferred in the past. I also wanted to welcome our distinguished guest, Ronald Blythe, who also is an honorary doctor of the University of Essex and gave the Burrows Lecture in 1990, I think, Ronnie. We thought it might have only been about 5 years ago, but the nature of time as it stretches in this sort of way. And welcome too to Ken Walpole, who gave the Burrows Lecture last year here. Richard's 30-plus groundbreaking books include, as you will have seen on the desk outside, Food for Free, Flora Britannica, Nature Cure, The Beautiful Barley Bird, Weeds recently, and a couple of new books turned out nice again about the weather, and the soil book as well. The weather one may not turn out nice. We may just go from winter to winter this year, who knows. Tonight's topic is edgelands, and it's a combination of themes picked out of 40 years of writing. Richard lives in Norfolk and the Waveney Valley with his partner Polly Lavender, who's here at the front. Delighted to welcome her and to hear as well. At the end of the lecture, Richard's going to give us his lecture, then we're going to migrate to the two waiting chairs here to take questions and answers for a little while. Around about 8 o'clock, we'll migrate upstairs. Richard will be signing books if anybody wants to talk to him and get books signed at that point. And that will then conclude 8:20, 8:30, that sort of time, just to give you a sense of where we're going. So, welcome, Richard. Thank you very much indeed. Over to you.
Thank you, Jules, and thank you all for coming out on a miserable day. I'm very happy and honoured to be standing here in a university that dubbed me. What I'm going to talk about, I think, will unravel during the evening. It probably is a rather mysterious title for many of you. Victor Hugo, of all people, I think, summed it up rather wonderfully in a phrase that I suspect is not in the script of Les Miserables, though that is the book from which it comes. He talks about an undefined hybrid habitat, terrain vague, he calls it, a landscape somewhat ugly but bizarre, made up of two different natures which surround certain great cities. To observe the city edge, Hugo wrote, is to observe an amphibian. End of trees, beginning of roofs. End of grass, beginning of paving stones. End of ploughed fields, beginning of shops. The end of the beaten track, the beginning of passions, the end of the murmur of things divine, the beginning of the noise of humankind. Well, that's a pretty good definition of what has now become a rather fashionable subject, an exploration of those kinds of landscapes and ways of social life and ecological systems that can't be neatly defined as either rural or urban. And it's a subject which arouses considerable passions, I think partly because we all of us see in it the future of what both town and country may become, and what nature may become, and that depending on our degrees of optimism or pessimism, we react accordingly, either with distaste at the crawling advance of edgelands, or glorification in the way it overturns some of our rather respectable views of how the world ought to be ordered. I can see both points of view. To give you an extreme example of the kind of revolutionary fervour that edgelands can stir up in you, I had an experience when I was exploring some of the edgelands near Heathrow Airport, a bit of country that I'll come back to later. And I came upon a specimen of that magnificent, invasive alien, giant hogweed, a plant which came over from the Caucasus in the mid-19th century as a poor man's alternative to the rich man's orchid. Here was a plant that you could grow in your back garden, that could reach 15 foot tall and have flowers the size of cartwheels. Behaved itself for nearly a century and then started expanding very rapidly through suburban Britain, especially in the edgelands. And since it causes rashes in people, began to be regarded as extremely nasty and is now actually illegal to plant out deliberately in the wild. Well, the specimen I found was rather special because it was on a piece of waste ground next to a flooded gravel pit, and it was surrounded by one of those red-striped danger tapes. Keep out. And I thought this was a wonderful joke, that this plant should be regarded not only as dangerous, but actually too dangerous to dig up. So instead of getting rid of it in the way that it is in some parts of the country, they had simply screened it off. I also thought that it was quite a good symbol of green defiance. This plant fenced off against the ordinary people, perhaps standing for a certain kind of feisty wildness that we didn't like to exist inside the respectable surrounds of an urban area. So I was pretty much in favour of that plant being there. If I'd been a true revolutionary, I would have taken the tape down, but I thought it made a kind of installation, a statement about the relationship we have with slightly dodgy wild things in cities. Foxes come into the same category, of course, these days. So I was taking one position there, seeing in this edgeland efflorescence a kind of act of insurrection against the tidiness and safety of the city. Others take other views. The political scientist Stephen Meyer wrote a very provocative and thoughtful book about 3 years ago called The End of the Wild. And he wrote very strongly against any kind of reverence for these odd survivals in strange places. What he called the triumph of adaptive generalists. And he wrote, "There will continue to be plenty of life covering the globe. Life will just be different, much less diverse, much less exotic, much more predictable, and much less able to capture the awe and wonder of the human spirit. Ecosystems will organize around a human motif. The wild will give way to the predictable, the common, the usual." Well, I'm not quite sure where giant hogweed surrounded by danger tape fits into that. It's nothing like as cozy or as predictable as he makes out this kind of new ecosystem is going to become. But it may well be coming, and we need to make a reckoning with it. And in a sense, it's my different explorations and feelings about that I wanted to explore, which are both in Hertfordshire, where I was born, and in Essex, where I later came to explore, very particularly to make a film about the wildlife of the edgelands. A central idea in what I want to talk about is the ecological idea of the ecotone. which is a kind of vegetation or territory which exists between two other sorts of place. A wood and a field has an ecotone in a band of scrub. It's a dynamic system. It can change one way or the other. It can be grazed away by wild animals, or it can be the advancing edge of the woodland. But it certainly has characteristics of both systems and some of its own. And ecotones, because they are dynamic like that, are very exciting places. Things happen in them. And not only social things, but ecological things as well. And I think that to regard the edgelands without that sort of trendy tag that has generated so many books in the last few years, but think about them as ecotones with that kind of ecological and sociological discipline, can make one see them in a quite different light, as engines of a third way, if you like. Well, I first encountered edgelands where I was born, in Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire, which was at the end of, well, not the end, but part of the area which the Metropolitan Railway Company called Metroland. A long story, the creation of that, but the idea basically was to drive a railway from West London out into the Chilterns, to buy land alongside it to sell to potential commuters, and thus to create an audience or a coterie of passengers who could use the line you've just built. It was creating the honeypot and the bee line. Well, I grew up on the edge of Metroland, and this year, as some of you may know, is the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the London Tube. And I was recently invited to write one of 12 books about the 12 lines of the London Underground system. And mine was the Metropolitan line because I had grown up in it. And I have to say, probably had my whole attitude to nature formed by that confrontation between the sedate edge of the town and the rampaging, investigating edge of nature. And I wanted somewhere to start the book, and probably far too much under the influence of Ian Sinclair and psychogeographers. I had a notion for looking for a rather special place, a rather special modern place, because I knew that somewhere the Metropolitan line and all the edges that surrounded it must cross the M25 with all its particular kind of edges. And when I looked for it, it happened to be in the most extraordinary place, bang in the middle of Chorley Wood, which is the epicenter of Metroland and of, any of you who've seen it, John Betjeman's famous film about the territory. Anyway, I actually found the intersection, which was in a deep cutting under the M25, and the little trains of the Metropolitan Railway line ran under this gigantic road system with about 6 inches to spare, so that they actually looked like Toy Town trains. And here's a description of spending some time in this curious place. Down in the cutting under the M25 Met Line synapse, I can see the funereal canopy of a Cedars estate in Chorley Wood shrubberies directly ahead, and glimpse the mock Tudor villas they shelter. I grub about among the pillars instead, peering at the weeds. They're an unexceptional waste-ground mix. Thistles, purple toadflax, tall sprays of hemlock with liver-spotted stems, busy clumps of that ancestral midden species, fat hen. I climb gingerly up towards the line, wondering if debris from passing road traffic has contributed to the delectation of passing rail passengers, peering through their sealed windows at the beginning of the green belt. Tomato bushes and holly trees have appeared in places like this, sprung from seeds in thrown-out burgers or the berries from crash-site votive wreaths. But there are no such floral parables. Then I spot the ivy, one of Metroland's signature species, restored to rustic respectability when the one young Queen Victoria began wearing diamond-studded ivy wreaths in her hair. It's snaking its erratic way up at least 4 of the concrete pillars and has already reached more than 6 feet high. On one of the columns nearest the road, I can just make out a maze of faint reticulations where an earlier generation of tendrils has been scraped off. That first invasion of ivy can't have begun much more than 30 years ago, yet these fossil traces already look like prehistoric graffiti. The ivy story is typical of the constantly changing fortunes of nature in edgelands. A species that's a natural climber of trees in the wild, not a parasite incidentally, it simply uses the trunk as scaffolding, finds a man-made artifact, in this case a concrete motorway pillar, 25 years old, and scales it exactly as it would an immemorial English oak. It even has the lowering shadow of the motorway to act as a simulacrum of woodland shade. Then humans notice the impertinent intruder and eradicate it from their modernist monument. The ivy, of course, still lurks in buried seeds and root fragments, and soon begins a new ascent. Nothing short of a scorched earth policy, not Chorleywood style, would exterminate it altogether. But it occurs to me that this ivy is an emblem not just of the opportunist liveliness that dogs the edges of metro country, but of my own clingy attachments to it. For much of my life I've been rooted elsewhere, but seem to have repeatedly sent out compulsive suckers towards these perverse, ambivalent, occasionally downright weird, but always inspiring backlands. I was born on the fringe of Metroland in the 1940s and spent my childhood running wild in its leftover patches. I came to work in another stretch in my 20s, and ever since have been drawn, either literally or in my imagination, to its provocative contrariness. Looking back at the line's history as I write, I'm intrigued by the way its development, its marriage of pastoral and technological dreams, mirrors my own. Well, that arrival in Metroland, in an edgeland, happened quite serendipitously as a result of my father having come across Hitler on a business trip to Germany and seen one of his SS meetings in the same hotel he was staying at. Came home to England and said to my mother, there's going to be a war, we're going to move to the country. And they chose Berkhamsted, which was not actually on the Metropolitan line, but in Metroland, being just 3 miles from the Metropolitan Railway. And we lived in a 1930s detached house that had been built on part of Graham Greene's uncle's old landscape estate. The Greens pretty much went broke in 1922, like a very large number of the rich people in Britain, and sold off their magnificent estate. Fortunately, they didn't sell off about 100 acres, which were just at the end of our garden, or of the road in which our house is situated. And this was an extraordinary landscape park, which was, as they would say in East Anglia, going back. It was grazed by a few Highland cattle, but basically it was an advancing scrubland with some immense landscape trees inside it. And we, of course, adored it and used it as our common. And it was in that area, running wild, that I think I began to develop the particular attitude towards nature that has remained with me ever since. A sense that organisation, the straight road of the new estate, the straight lines of the railway that served it, would always be upset by the advances of nature on its edges. And I'll just read you a little bit about those days. Metroland, of course, was meant to encourage in the people who'd bought the houses along the line a kind of old English pastoral sense of reverence for quaintness, of a belief in placidity, and a certainty that even though they were going to have to rush for the 7:15 train in the morning, in some way they were reenacting the dawn walks of their agricultural ancestors. There's actually a marvellous little... this is one of the Metropolitan Company's advertising pitches for the Chilterns where I lived. This is a good parcel of English soil in which to build home and strike root. Inhabited from old, as witness the lines of camps on the hilltops and confused mounds amongst the woods. The great dyke which crossed it east and west, the British trackways, the Roman road aslant the eastern border, the pack-horse ways worn deep into the hillsides, the innumerable field paths which mark the labourer's daily route from hamlet to farm. The new settlement of Metroland proceeds apace. The new settlers thrive amain. Amain. I wonder how many times that word had been used since the medieval period. That was a Metroland brochure, 1927. This is what I wrote. This is where our neighbourhood story starts to wander from the utopian blueprint laid down by the Metropolitan Railway. The two new settlements, that was the one we lived, but then also a council estate on the far side of the landscape park. The two new settlements were separated by about 100 acres of the old park, rough grassland, specimen trees, terraced tennis courts, walled gardens, all the trappings of a grand estate, which remained as an undeveloped no man's land, slowly returning to the wild. It became, of course, an adventure playground for every child that lived in its two contrasting estates, which could just see each other across the park. Grammar diggers and council bugs, as we called each other, glowered across the scrub like rival football supporters, jealous respectively of the other's street skills and home privileges. But we rubbed along, as adjacent tribes must do, and somehow worked out a code of territorial rights and acceptable behaviour. The hall itself survived for a while as a boys' prep school, but became infested with rot and had to be demolished. Its brick remains lay like two long tumuli at the foot of the park, full of cryptic secrets and possibilities. When I began seriously exploring this wilderness in the early 50s, our neighbourhood gang of 9 to 12-year-olds called it the field, as if it were the only one in creation. It had evolved into a kind of common, and was not being played in by the sedate rules of Metroland at all. Our dads dug up turfs from the park's derelict lawns to lay them their own modest greenswards, and recycled the hall's elegant bricks and marble in their garden walls. They were mostly city workers, and walking to and from the station, they wore out their own innumerable footpaths, based around a diagonal transect across the field, from which small side tracks radiated to individual back garden gates. With an entrepreneurial spirit that matched that of the railway company, our gang recognised the market potential of this regular throughway and its captive audience, and set up an orange box stall alongside it, under one of the park's great walnut trees. We nicked vegetables from our father's gardens and sold them back to the hapless growers as they trudged home for supper, too tired and vulnerable, and maybe a mite proud of our cheek, to resist. In the landscape between, increasingly a jungle of feral ornamental trees and burgeoning hawthorn scrub, we created our own network of camps and inscrutable mounds, impressive in their complexity and aboriginal sense of occupation, despite a total absence of provenance, and acted out the fantasy of being Amazonian explorers. We learned to cook on wood fires, churn butter on upturned bicycles, build huts, invent a kind of Lord of the Flies sex, and devised ways of torturing kids from the council estate when they strayed across our boundaries. All entirely proper skills for pioneering settlers. Well, that was my social introduction to a kind of feral childhood that could only be lived, I think, in that kind of zone where you're stuck between two different sorts of code. The new code of the invading settlers from London, the old code that's not spoken but kind of radiates from the land itself and compels you almost, impels you to read traces and signs in the land. We learnt these things. We were all, none of us were country kids. We'd all come from city parentage, but somehow we picked up fieldcraft in that place. But we couldn't have done it in the real countryside, I think. We would have been slaughtered. Anyway, I went on living in that place for a long time and began to get closer to edgelands and to closer to Essex as well. Later in my life, when I got my first job working for penguins, and that was situated out in the land that surrounds, I suppose, between Uxbridge and Heathrow Airport, an extraordinary labyrinth of derelict gravel pits and disused canals and victorias and refuse tips. And I was in my early 20s completely astonished that I'd landed a job with a publishing company like Penguins, and was intoxicated, not just by the work I was doing, but by this extraordinary place in which I'd pitched down, which seemed to touch some echoes of those experiences in the field amongst the decaying cedars of Lebanon. And in my lunch breaks, I used to go out wandering in this extraordinary edgeland round there, into the old bottle tips that had developed into a kind of new urban forest with huge buddleia trees and giant hogweed and Japanese knotweed, all reaching up to the level that you would expect sapling trees to reach. It was a kind of vegetation that existed nowhere else on the planet. It needed the particular coming together of some rough, open soil and the particular commerce of this part of London to bring this vegetation to fruition. You go to edgelands in other cities and you find different mixtures, escapes from the kind of plants that people customarily go in their allotments in places like Sheffield. Other kinds of plants, lots of willows, if you go to edgeland habitats in Bristol, and Mediterranean ones as well that have escaped onto the walls. But the ones near London Airport had this particular signature, and I was astonished by it. Astonished not just botanically by the extraordinariness of the flora, but by the ability of this burgeoning life to survive in an environment that we were taught was not where things were able to live. Nature there seemed either magnanimous, I'm being anthropomorphic, whatever I say about it, either magnanimous or insurrectionary. It was refusing to lie down and be beaten by industrial dereliction. And if you looked at it through the kind of eyes that I was developing at that time, it was not only resisting industrial dereliction, it was beautifying it. It was the repair system that nature had brought into these places. Wasn't what conventional botanists like. 50% of the plants that grow there didn't come from this country at all. They came from probably 4 different continents across the globe. Yet they'd come together because of this continual unruliness of the habitat and the disturbance of the soil. And they made the place good again. And anyone who said to me it would be better without them, it would be better as brown earth, then I think should have booked a seat on the first spaceship to Mars. Anyway, I, in the end, became so captivated by the wildlife of London's edgelands that I wrote a book about it myself called The Unofficial Countryside. It was far from being original. Richard Jefferies had written a lot about London's wildlife in the 19th century. Kenneth Alsop, I think there are some people old enough to remember him here, was my hero and had written some astonishing journalism and 2 outstanding books about the wildlife of London after he was demobbed with surgical TB after the war. And his style was one which I began to ape in some ways, a rather jazzy, cosmopolitan style which seemed to me to fit the kind of wildlife that had moved into these places. So the book got written and I think was well received by people who perhaps thought it was more original than it was. And the exciting thing that happened after that is that BBC commissioned a film on it, in which I was to become the presenter and retrace my raggle-taggle steps around the perimeters of London for the camera. And this is what eventually took me into Essex edgelands, which also have their own signature. They're cousins to all other edgelands, but are especially Essex. And I think the first one we found was by the power station at Barking. We'd gone there originally to film the fish filter. Being a water-cooled power station, Barking has this very elaborate netting through which the cooling water has to pass to stop fish getting into the machinery. And it became an extraordinary impromptu and quite serendipitous way of identifying what fish were returning to the Thames. The power station was right on the Essex edge of the Thames. And a wonderful ichthyologist called Alwyn Wheeler was the man we interviewed and filmed on that day. And he went through the fish filter, finding all these extraordinary beasts, baby salmon and plaice and smelt and eels. I think at that stage he'd logged more than 100 different species that were returning to the Thames, which it only had about 10 in the 1940s. But there was another interesting thing which we never actually got on film, which was that every night the fish filter was raided. There was a travellers' encampment on a wonderful piece of waste ground that lay between the power station and the Lever soap factory, about quarter of a mile away. And each night they came over the fence and nicked the lemon sole and anything else they could find off the fish filter to take home to cook for supper. So Alwyn Wheeler's records early in the morning were always rather sparse, and he needed to wait for the evening catch to get a decent record. The second really extraordinary Essex edgeland experience we had was at the old Ford Works at Dagenham, because this was a place in its prime where tumbleweed grew. You know that wonderful plant that whisks around the deserts in American westerns. It's not an American plant, in fact. It was taken from Russia to America by Ukrainian settlers, but took very well to desert conditions in America, as it was really a steppe plant in Russia. And its biology is really quite canny. It dries off in the summer, detaches itself from the ground, and bowls off in the wind, scattering seeds as it goes. It's its way of distributing itself. Well, we heard about these, the Dagenham colony of tumbleweed, Russian thistle as it's properly called, and wanted very much to film it. The reason they'd got there was in itself an extraordinary and telling story. The Ford works there had a lot of imports from the States, as you might understand, and particularly from some of the branches of the company that were in the deep south and in the far west, where tumbleweed was really very common. And the seeds seemingly got caught up in the packing material. And when they were beached at the back of Dagenham, they found a habitat which was very, very like the hot desert in which they thrived in the United States, because there was a foundry at Dagenham, and the ashes were thrown out, and it was on this ash that the tumbleweed actually took root. Well, they were already beginning to decline as the Ford works shrunk in the 1970s when we were filming, but there was still enough, and we were able to wait for a windy day, and sure enough, up they got and started bowling about the car park at Dagenham until they crashed into the fencing, which secured the new cortinas. So we got a wonderful piece of film, which was a little bit echoed my hogweed story of the tumbleweeds meeting the fence and saying something about the nature of cities and the nature of wasteland and the weird echoes there are between open deserts and open factory land. The last example from Essex I want to give is something I did for my book on weeds, and Jules was very kindly my guide on this occasion. We went to look at the plotlands at Basildon. This survival of an amazing self-build community, something like 5,000 houses at one stage, on land which was given over, not entirely, it began in the late 19th century, but then there was a big gift of land after the First World War, the homes for heroes, the little patches of land. And at its prime, I suppose, up to the Second World War, and for some time after the Second, this was a quite remarkable landscape in which there was a wild substrate of ash trees and oaklings, but inside them, this matrix of planted species of little apple trees and roses and lilacs. Eventually, Basildon Council closed the place down, bulldozed it, except for a few little relics, but didn't touch the vegetation. And in 1989, I think it was, turned it into an official nature reserve, nearly 400 acres in extent. And to go down it now is a quite hallucinogenic experience, because you will come upon little bits that the bulldozers spared, a pillar box marooned amongst sprouting willows, a piece of what looked like for a moment traveller's joy, but in fact is the end of a telegraph wire that somebody forgot to clear away. There are wild roses and cultivated roses climbing up the remains of old chimney hearths. And slowly, two ecosystems are merging. What those settlers brought in, their little fruit trees, their wallflowers, their soapwort, that lovely bouncing bet that was a favourite garden plant at the time, are being invaded by native vegetation, by the first ashes and oaks, and even Essex's, perhaps I would call it, signature tree, the hornbeam. And it seems to me that this place was a site of real hope, of the possibility that the scars that we create by building factories, building railways, putting up housing estates without thought for green space doesn't terminate nature, and that with the slightest possibility, a new kind of nature, perhaps not the one we've always had, but something that is cosmopolitan, adaptable, prepared to shift around, prepared to tolerate us, indeed prepared to actually make use of us in transporting its seeds and making the kind of disturbance it likes. And I think this is a thing to ponder. Won't really be wild at all, because it will all have come in on the coattails of human beings. I don't see it despondently like that. I think he's right in one sense, in that the adaptive generalists will massively increase, but they're not dull. They're as lively as anything that we have here at the moment. And as I've tried to explain in some of these examples, they're setting up their own ecosystems. And I think we may have to learn to live with them, because we are destroying so much of what we presume to be aboriginal wild vegetation that we are, like it or not, creating habitats for precisely this kind of edgeland ecosystem. Thank you.